The terrific trio that is fighting for championship. It's the stage where legends are made and history is written. This is this 87th edition of the Tata Steel Chess, the Wimbledon of chess. And today, a champion will be crowned. Gukesh, Pragnanda, or will it be Nordebek, who does need a miracle to stay in the fight as the games are heating up. The action is on. I'm Tanya Sachdev alongside me, Grandmaster David Howell and Hari Krishna on our screens, who is facing Nordebek Abdusatro. What's going on there, David? Uh, where is he looking? Has he fallen off to sleep or not?
Some players calculate by looking up at the ceiling. Kind of three-player group that we're talking about. Hari Krishna fighting against one of them, Nodibek Abdusattorov, but the other two leaders there, Gukesh and Prag, those two 1 point ahead of Abdusattorov. My eyes are focused on the top right, therefore, on the red board, where Gukesh didn't find the move bishop to f3. So I think everyone in chat deserves a pat on the back for saying that was just too difficult. It clearly wasn't his opening prep any longer, and I agree, that move, I think maybe just a step too far, just a risk too far in a final round like this. In the meantime, the bottom row, that green board, the Karo Khan has evolved to look almost like a kind of reverse King's Indian defense, Tanya, with a very blocked structure. So a very different type of position between Vincent Keimer and Pragnananda. What do you make of the developments there? Who should be happier? Is Prag enjoying his chances, or do you think he might have been regretting his opening choice?
Two very different storylines in the games of these two leaders, right? For Prague, it's a solid strategic fight right now, yet to blow up. Definitely has promises of being an exciting middle game, but hasn't quite reached it yet, and that is on the right side. He's playing against Vincent Keimer, a very strong and a very solid player. He's the prodigy of Peter Lecco, so Prague knows that he can't take this lightly in any way, even though Vincent hasn't had the tournament of his life and Prague has been on his A game. Prague's strategy, it feels like it's going to be just to try and get a longer game, that pawn on d4 that he's managed. Black's knight can jump to the center of the board and start asking some awkward questions to that white queen. In fact, David, if white is a little careless here, and for example, makes a no move, like an a3 or a king shift, b5, knight e5, and you might be in trouble very quickly.
Yeah, I think we will jump into that board just to give some updates and to show that there is potentially a big threat in the position on the part of Vincent Keimer there. And that's a great spot, Tanya. Black's last move was to develop this knight, and maybe the knight is heading into the center. But just to break down the last few moves that we have missed since we were last here, let's rewind back to move 6. We left it with Black's knight coming out, putting some pressure on the white center. Very understandably, but definitely shows that Black is better. b5 would kick this white knight back to the edge of the board. I chose now this move, knight to e5, does look very, very scary for the white queen. Not quite trapped Tanya, but yeah, at least this is something that Vincent should be trying to avoid.
And one way that White often avoids these thematic ideas is to go a4, right? Which is a motif where you control the b5 square. But I want to point out another plan that you see played out in these positions by black, which is not only trying to bring the c6 knight to e5, but the kingside knight can reroute itself from f6 to d7 and then land at the center of the board to that e5 square as well, David. To your earlier question, how should Prog be feeling about his position? I think it's an imbalance. The pawn formation is not symmetrical. Black has this d4 pawn, these plans to play for, piece maneuvering, which does place the pieces on better squares. Not so easy to see how White is taking advantage or making use of that bishop pair just yet, especially that light squared bishop, which doesn't have its counterpart, but also doesn't have an active diagonal. Prog should be happy about this opening outcome, is the feeling I get.
Yeah, I mean, the more we look at it, the more I agree. Simply, Tanya. At first, I thought, he's facing the bishop pair. You know, if White ever gets kind of the time to go g3, move the queen out of the way, go f4, then White gets beautiful kind of pawn structure on the king side. But yeah, unfortunately, in chess, you don't get three moves in a row. And of course, especially if the opponent has some threats of his own, then you start to get a bit worried. I mean, in terms of the tournament situation, Tanya, just one question here. What if Vincent has decided, okay, no more advantage for White, and he just wants to bail out into what looks like an opposite color bishop position, bishop to g5? This would be my chess C question, which is linked to the tournament standings. Is a draw going to be enough for Prague? For example, this type of structure is what I'm thinking about. If the queens ever come off, how much can he hope for in terms of winning chances? Does he retain any chances to win here?
That's a great question. We might even see this being played out. And I believe whether it's 8-6 or b5, the continuation for Vincent, once he commits that bishop on that diagonal, would be to take it to this opposite color bishop endgame where, yes, you can fight on. And let's just show this line. You trade the queens, pawn takes queen, the knight perhaps falls back. One still gets the feeling here, and David, I see the bar, it's slightly edging to white, that black should be fine. Again, you've got this piece activity, the e5 square, the knight jumping on b4, the rook lining up on c8, the b5 pawn nicely controlled c4, the bishop on e2, still far away from getting very active. Given the tournament situation, it's one of those cases, right? And it reminds me of the candidates when Hikaru felt he had to play for a win on the very last round. How much risk are you really willing to take? Because you don't know what's going to happen on the boards of the other rivals that are there. Right now, if Prague has taken a look at Gukesh's board, it's an absolutely crazy position. Anything could happen. It's a game for three results. Playing it safe, yes, you're taking that shot where if Gukesh was to lose or draw, you're at least guaranteed a tiebreak. But in that three result game, if Gukesh does get that winning shot, then you've kind of let go of your opportunity. But with the black pieces, I don't think it's too much. It's too disappointing for Prague to get this kind of an endgame. It feels like a fight for two results. He's playing against a very strong opponent. If White doesn't want to push, there's only so much that Prague can do. So he's got to play the position as much as the tournament situation. I don't think a draw is an absolute disaster for Pragnananda today.
Yeah, it's very interesting because sometimes when we're calculating, we just rule out certain moves. We're like, oh no, that will lead to a draw, so I cannot play that. But it might just be the best move. And yeah, for Vincent, maybe that's going through his mind, kind of on the inverse. Of course, the tournament isn't at stake for Vincent here, who we see on the camera. But yeah, he might be thinking, okay, bishop g5 leads to a endgame, equal chances. Maybe that's not enough. I want more. Hence his decision to play a4. You mentioned the other natural response to Black's kind of threat there, the semi-threat of b5. So at least securing the c4 square for his knight for a move or two longer. At some point, Prag might decide, okay, a6, b5 is still on the cards anyway. Or maybe he'll take a timeout and kind of play h6 to prevent Whites from using the g5 square. Another move I really love that you mentioned, Tanya, knight back to d7. Also coming towards the queen side, some weak squares over here. Especially I'm looking at b4, b3, some squares that aren't protected by pawns. Okay, I think in terms of Prag's winning chances, they might have gone up after this a4 move. I'm not saying he's better, but at least no endgame means a bit more fun.
Mm.
potentially. And yeah, Vincent, he's been showing fighting chess despite not being anywhere near his best throughout this event, I would say.
As a commentator, also very happy to see A4 on the board. So at least the end game is far off, and it's going to be a fun fight in this one. But there's a lot of fun happening on our other board, David, for Gukesh. I mean, that one has been fire from the very start, a very non conventional approach in the Petrov defense. And what we have in front of us is just action Ultra Pro Max, because I do spot that there is the last move that Arjun's played. It looks like a pawn sacrifice. David, should we head over?
Let's do it. Let's jump straight there while Gukesh is in the tank thinking right now. And a quick recap, because there were some big developments. We left it just 2 moves ago. But yeah, a long, long time ago at this point. The players have been investing their time wisely, I would say. This last move, bishop to h3 for black, trying to get rid of white's light squared bishop. We did eventually conclude that the best move, or at least the computer move, normally meaning the best move, is bishop to f3, sacrificing the exchange. White's bishop is so powerful potentially on this diagonal. The d5 pawn is also relatively hard for black to defend, but bishop f3 proving a risk too far for Gukesh. He instead exchanged bishops. Yeah, very scary to allow a queen to swoop in like this, I must say, but queen f3 is his solution. At least he can bail out and take the queens off the board if he wants at some point, Tanya. But h5 showing Arjun's intentions. h4, one idea to open the rook. Also knight g4 supported now. I like black. I don't think he's better necessarily, Tanya, but it feels like momentum on Arjun's side now.
Yeah, and first I want to say, I think you mentioned this earlier as well, that our chat, it showed a great understanding about the psychology at this stage and the risk factor that came with sacrificing the exchange in that moment. And if you haven't had a look at it before, or, as commentators, we again have the ability to take back, and we have the engine, the bar guiding us as and when we need it. It's a very difficult move to make. So you can't really fault Gukesh for not going for bishop f3. But we did also mention this, right? If the bishops are traded off, it felt as if Arjun should be able to neutralize any advantage that white has as the first mover. And the idea is that you're panning out. H4 coming in with an attack. Knight G4, something always to keep in mind as well, to open up the H line. David, the bailout that you mentioned with Queen F5, because of the expansion that Gukesh has done on the queen side with the pawns, I believe that endgame, if it favors anyone, it should be black. The healthier pawn formation, the weaknesses that we see on the left side of the board that you're so kindly highlighting, the knight jumping in, the d4 pawn perhaps being a target, because it's Arjun who's got the dark squared bishop that can land on certain squares, attacking that pawn. I don't think Queen f5 is a happy bailout at all. And the most important question here is, Gukesh had that pawn sacrifice a few moves ago. It was declined. H5 is also a pawn sacrifice. That D5 pawn right now can be picked up. And I think, David, that's the line that we need to check out. That's the line that's on Gukesh's radar. What happens after knight takes pawn? How powerful is Arjun's H line attack?
Yeah, Tanya, I must admit, and I feel so ashamed of this, I didn't even see that the pawn was hanging. I'm normally a pawn grabber. Normally I have this kind of radar that goes off. I have this siren that goes off, being like, "Oh, there's a pawn, go for it." And I was just so scared of Black's kingside play, like h4 coming, that I was just kind of in defensive mode here. I was like, "Okay, get the queens off, survive, survive." But you're right, we have to investigate. It is a pawn sacrifice. And Gukesh, clearly this was his intention with his last move, Queen f3, to go and take this pawn. So the big question, first question is Knight g4. Is that a move? Is it h4? Do we take knights off the board first, deflect away this white knight from the defense? I'm a bit scared of knight f4 as a defensive resource to kick away the black queen. Okay, it's a bit mysterious, actually. Like the first move, I would probably start by taking, just because default setting for me in my brain is like make things simple. But should we jump in? Should we place the moves?
Let's do it. And I think we have to look at the most direct line that you're pointing out and what happens after h4. Yes, white has an extra pawn, but there are threats with not only on the king side, David, but the rook lined up against the d4 pawn as well. It does look pretty precarious for white. Knight f4 is a key defending idea that you pointed out, and it might be the move in this position. But how much of a defense is this really? If black just sidesteps, falls back with the queen, queen to f5 looks like a beautiful square. You're also threatening g5 at the right moment, taking advantage of the pin on that knight to f4, the pawns that you're highlighting, b5, c2, d4. take your pick. This looks like tremendous comp for black.
Yeah, great competition. I fully agree. Like bishop d6, bishop b4, even if you just kind of play on without taking any of these pawns, at some point the h file will open, and at some point it does look like white needs to pull the brake and try to get the queens off before it's too late, before he simply gets checkmated. Yeah, suddenly I think Gukesh probably got to this point where like queen f3 in his calculation a few moves back, when he decided not to go for that exchange sacrifice, he saw maybe h5 was possible. He was like, okay, I take, and then I play knight f4, I kick the queen out, and I'm a pawn up. But of course, there's always a sting in the tail. There's always one move you have to go further. And yeah, I must admit, queen f5, just the fact that it's such a multi-purpose move makes things look so nice for black suddenly. And I can see you've got your calculation face on, Tanya. I'm trying to read your your body language this time. And what are you calculating? How does white?
I was actually trying to visualize something and wonder if I'm just walking into a checkmate. After knight takes knight, h4, white's knight is on d5. Can white actually get super greedy? And now that you have the position on the this is the scariest for me out of all of these.
Yeah. Just to show everyone at home, I don't think rook takes knight quite works, because after a recapture, you can take a pawn. It does look like checkmate, but white can jump back with a queen, and if there's no mate, like you can take another pawn, but white's king hides. Yeah, if there's no mate, you've just sacrificed the exchange for nothing. So, okay, let's look at the move you thought was the most scary. I agree.
I also want to point out the other move that you wanted to say before we go into bishop d6, although I see that this is probably the worst of them all, that rook to d7, at least white has a check on e8, forcing a repetition.
Uh-huh. Maybe this is best. Oh no, we're going to see a draw, Tanya. Oh,
no.
Yeah, black has to block.
This is not how this one ends.
Yeah, now white has to defend. And the knight and this one, so oh no. Just to point out, bishop d6, not liked by. Yeah. Is it just knight f4 again? Maybe hitting the queen. If you keep the queens on, this time white can force them off the board with queen to e6. If you take this knight, then again this pesky c7 square threatened checkmate here. Rook d7. Now the white queen just moves, I guess. Oh, she's nearly trapped. Whoops. She has to go to g6 only square, and the white bishop will defend its king.
Very nice.
Yeah.
David, I'm not going to be happy if you get the queen f7, queen e8 rep. that's going to be a bit of a downer. Let's just hope that doesn't happen. But it's also not a forced path. How much of this does it depend on? What do you think, as a player, David, as a super grandmaster yourself, seeing this pawn on d5 hanging and the f7 pawn hanging, but the dangers that it brings with it, you're looking at moves like bishop d6 in that last position, you're looking at rook d7. How easy it is to go down this path, or how difficult is it to actually get greedy in this position as white?
Yeah, I would say it's very difficult. I mean, Gukesh, maybe it's less difficult because he's so good at calculation. And I mean, if we just replay that line to show our big fear or our conclusion as well, I mean, this is a forcing move. Firstly, you have to also calculate h4 first. I think h4 is less tempted because knight f4, there's no queen to f5. The square is covered. So it makes sense to trade a set of knights first. So knight takes d5, forcing move, h4. Some scary threats here. So he definitely gets to this point in his calculation. Then he looks at knight f4. He's like, oh, whoops, queen f5. There's too many pawns hanging. And yeah, this is a nasty pin on the white knight as well. g5, as you mentioned, Tanya. And then you're like, okay, knight to f4, not possible. But then you're like, oh, wait, I can take a pawn, threaten checkmate. Bishop d6 doesn't work out, as we showed. White drops the knight back. And then you probably look at rook takes d5, doesn't work. But rook d7. And he might get here in his calculation and realize it is a draw. And then, I don't know, we know Gukesh, we saw him yesterday against Jordan Van Forest. He even played a move that should have lost him the game from a drawn position just because he wanted to keep things going. He was that desperate to prolong the fight. So even if he calculates all of this, which is very possible, then I think he's just going to see rook d7 and turn away from it and
Hmm.
rule it out. Any other move than allowing a draw. For Arjun, maybe the path is less clear. Maybe he's obliged to just go for this since he is sacrificing a pawn or two in this variation. So Tanya, yeah, to answer your question, I think it's very possible, but the fact it's Gukesh means he's calculated it all, and he will be trying, we hope, to avoid the draw.
And that's really up Kukesh's alley, right? To avoid a draw. How many times you've seen that happen? And in fact, I remember during the World Championship, on many of the Magnus's takes, he would triple take or take. Whenever he had his recaps, he often mentioned that this will that he has to play on and to keep the game going. Sometimes the evaluation at the end of that isn't as clear or isn't as accurate as Gukesh takes it to be. He's managed to get himself into trouble just by wanting the game to go on. And we saw that happen yesterday as well against Jordan Van Forest. Now, David, H5, it also comes down to how he's feeling about this position because, and we say this a lot, optically, it looks very strong for black. Like black is getting closer to white's king faster. But this younger generation, they don't care about the optics of a position. They just sit down and calculate. It's brute force for them. So how confident he's feeling about actually defending and fighting against ideas of h4, knight g4 will determine whether he goes for this line or not. And if it's not knight takes pawn, will his will to go on to keep the game going to avoid that long repetition with rook d7, rook d8, make him take the dubious decision of going into an endgame where then you just have to keep things together, keep kind of struggling for that draw with the pawn expansion on the queen side, queen to f5? Is that really the best alternative you have to that?
Oof. Yeah, now that we've found a way for white to not be worse, at least to force that draw. I mean, yeah, I agree. Rather than going to worse endgame and risking that, I think maybe knight takes d5 is the most pragmatic solution. But yeah, it's just the tournament situation. Suddenly, I mean, what you were saying there, Tanya, I'm getting flashbacks to 2013. Again, it might seem like ancient history, but the candidates tournament where Magnus Carlsen and Vladimir Kramnik were both in joint first. So very similar, eerily similar to the situation here. Those two players were in joint first. They were watching each other's games. Kramnik had black there. He was like, oh, I need to take some risks. Magnus is going to win. I need to win as well just to keep up. Magnus with white ended up losing to Peter Svidler. And yeah, Kramnik lost as well because he'd taken so many risks. So the two leaders ended up losing. Magnus won on tie breaks and, of course, became world champion eventually. But this could happen again. Like, if Prag takes too many risks, he could end up losing. If Gukesh is like, oh no, Prag might win and kind of plays not the best move on purpose, he might end up being in trouble as well. There's just no guarantees. I think that's the conclusion. There's nothing you can take for granted here. You do not guarantee you outplay someone super strong like Aragaisi in an endgame, especially a worse endgame with queen to f5. And yeah, taking this pawn looks like the other main option. Maybe it's just kind of a lack of options here, Tanya. I don't really see anything other than getting the queens off or taking this pawn. So Gukesh, his hand might be forced. What do you think he's going to do?
If he has to keep the game going, I mean, his natural instinct is to not go for a line that's a forcing draw. And maybe there is an alternative to not taking on f7. It's hard to spot because if you don't go for that line where we saw the repetition, white looks like you could be in big trouble, right? Knight takes knight, h4. And how are you fighting all these threats on the board if it's not for queen takes pawn? It's also the only square. The queen also needs to stay connected to that white knight on d5. For Gukesh, the problem here could be just fighting his own instinct of the fact that he knows that this leads to a forced draw. He wants to keep the game going, but the move that leads the game to go on is going to land in a worse endgame. And we've got knight takes pawn on the board. It's the other knight, but we might be seeing the same continuation if Arjun does trade on d5 and push that h pawn. David, are we going to see this repetition? Does this game end in a draw in the next few moves?
I'm notoriously bad at predicting. I literally predict everything wrong. Like commentators
Let's
curse
say yes.
whatever I say. It's going to be the opposite. So if I say it's going to be a draw, that means they'll play on. So I'm going to say it's a draw
Love
after
it.
that takes night. Um, Tanya, I was a bit surprised you took with this knight because and I do see the eval bar shift slightly. So I'm wondering if
Hmm.
now that the e knight has gone, whether Arjun can actually play the immediate h4. We mentioned that this isn't possible in the other variation. I'll just put this on the board quickly. Arjun debating whether to take knights. Now there's no queen takes f7, so we can kind of celebrate that the game continues. But the big difference here is knight f4, which was the resource last time. Queen f5 wasn't possible with a knight on e3, but with a knight on c3, maybe it's still strong. Is Arjun gonna go for the win now? Maybe it's not Gukesh playing kind of avoiding the draw. Maybe it's Arjun with h4. Looks scary.
That's a really interesting difference that you just pointed out. And again, you know, it also feels like a counterintuitive move, right? Because that knight is closer to your king. Again, Gukesh taking these decisions, how he's evaluated this attack is the big question. Because that knight on e3, intuitively, we were always picking it up with a c3 knight. You want your pieces closer to the king. A knight is a king's best friend as a defender. So knight takes pawn without going into the depths of it. It just felt like c3 was the knight that needed to land on d5, giving Arjun these extra possibilities. And Arjun goes into that looking into the distance but calculating it down over the next 20 moves in his head zone right now. Is Arjun going to go for this, well, the safer approach is what I want to call it relatively now, where you trade on d5 and walk into this potential repetition, or will he get ambitious and play for more with h4? The ball is in Arjun's court. And David,
Yeah,
knowing Arjun Argaisi, despite how the tournament's fared for him and how difficult it's been for him, if he spots a chance to keep this going, he's going to grab it with both hands.
you're 100% right. We saw that yesterday, Tanya, where he beat one of the players at the top of the table, Nodibek Abdusattorov. So he's riding on a high. Arjun, despite having a tough tournament here, he got his first ever win at the Tata Steel Masters yesterday. So maybe he's on a roll. h4. I'm just trying to get to the bottom of it. The only
Hmm.
reason, the only justification I can come up with for Gukesh taking with the e knight is that he unleashes his bishop. And we did see a similar variation where the bishop will sit on g3 to defend. I notice the bar drops even more now. So is there a breakthrough? I think this is the key position in Arjun's calculations. It might be his time to strike, as Scholke GD says there. But how to strike after bishop f4?
Oh,
He's a pawn down.
one. Sorry, David, go on.
No, I was just saying he is a pawn down, so he needs to be quick, Tanya.
But it does feel like this has to be a lot of compensation. You have to rely on concrete ideas, but also that d4 pawn being weak. You mentioned that bishop coming to defend on that f4 square. Well, black's got a counterpart, right? And at some point, and I'm trying to work out, do you take on g3 first or not? But to move bishop to d6, either before or after taking, as well, very attractive to me here. Get rid of your opponent's defensive piece. And once again, bishop d6, not the best. Is it queen f5?
Mm-hmm. Queen f5.
After bishop d6, David, bishop d6, trade on d6, rook d6, and queen f5.
Oh, oh, here, queen f5. Wow, that wasn't even on my radar, Tanya.
A
What a
bit
spot.
crazy, but oh, it works.
Wow, beautiful. Knight check. Royal fork. And yeah, that was a problem for black. Big, that big fork. Yeah, attacking the rook, defending this pawn, attacking this pawn, attacking this pawn. That's a beautiful knight on the f5 square. Actually, like, I was about to say, I had no idea why white is better here. It just looks like a really scary attack, but you solved it. As soon as the queens come off, now Gukesh is in the driver's seat. Queen f5, what a move. So it's
It
not
might
bishop d6.
It might be the only one in that position to keep the balance queen f5. And then suddenly, like you said, that knight that lands there, beautiful piece. David, perhaps black's way forward then is to first trade on g3, and only once the white bishop falls on g3, the position that we were looking at, now that it's pinned and lined up against the black queen, now you put your bishop on g6, bishop on d6, I'm sorry, and just continue the pressure.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's how the top players calculate, right? They look at variations like bishop d6, they see queen f5, whoops, can't do that, then they backtrack, and yeah, I think you found it. You've nailed it there, Tanya. This pin is really annoying. I just got to mention, like, knight takes knight does look like you damaged the black pawn structure, but now you open up a second file for the black rook to come down. This just looks like checkmate almost, and Erigaisi plays h4. He doesn't want a draw, he wants more, and wow. What a battle we're having here. But Gukesh, again, that desire to play on to give Arigasi more choice there, it might have backfired slightly. He's facing a really scary initiative.
Could not have asked for more from this matchup, right? And Arjun, with that last move, he's playing for the win here. He could have gone for a line where perhaps a repetition was White's best option there. But instead, he keeps the dream alive. He keeps the hopes alive in the position. He's striking with h4. We might be seeing bishop to f4 land here. Because, David, when we worked out that queen f5 idea, right, it's perhaps also the defensive resource that Gukesh is relying on in that position.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Maybe in his mind, he's like bishop f4, bishop d6. I swap, and then I swap queens with that nice trick you showed. And yeah, I'm better in an endgame. But I mean, after bishop f4, the bishop on g3 is so unstable as well. It can get exchanged by black's bishop, by black's knight, even white's pawn structure alone. Like being a pawn up is one thing, but if you have to play moves like bishop f4 and then take with your bishop, you are left with an isolated pawn on h2, isolated pawn on f2, super weak pawn on d4, and weak pawns all over the queen side. So yeah, it's not even being a pawn up. That's the main thing there for white. It's I think he's just fighting for survival, Gukesh, in that type of position. Wow.
This this is big pressure on the world champion, as now he slows down after h4. And also, I want to point out that at no point do we see Gukesh have the time to offer a queen trade. You can't pick up that g3 pawn with your own queen or fall back to with your queen to g2 because that queen needs to stay connected to that knight on d5. Black's knight on f6 and the rook on d8 are attacking that piece, so you can't really bail out with a trade at any point. It needs to stay on f3. David, earlier you mentioned that Arjun has a lopsided score against Gukesh and 4 wins, I believe. Uh, and I was thinking about it, and perhaps that has something to do with the style that these two players bring on, right? Where Arjun doesn't let any player get into his head. If he sees an opportunity, he goes for the absolute mess, absolute complications on the board, where he really tries to drag you into those muddy positions where it's chaos galore, anything can happen. And for Gukesh, sometimes evaluation becomes a problem. He has this will to play on. He's an incredible calculator, but many times in his post-game analysis, we notice that long lines or variations which he estimated at a certain point are actually not how it eventually appears to be.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and without naming names, I've talked to some very strong players about this new generation, and they were telling me basically the way to play against Arjun is actually to take the fun out of the position, to take all the tactics out, just to try and make it boring because he gets frustrated. He wants to create. He's a creator, and he's so imaginative. But if you take all the fun out, then sometimes he just doesn't have enough to hit you with. But Gukesh never takes the fun out of the position. He never takes the sting out. He allows Arjun to play. So you're right. The style, I mean, a 4-0 kind of head to head shows that clearly style wise, Arjun quite enjoys playing against Gukesh. And
Mhm.
I'm not sure who would you say is the fire, who is the ice here, Tanya, but they're both quite cool customers. Either way, it looks like Arjun again causing his compatriot here some problems.
Both their styles, I think it's fire and ice for both of them, and the house usually burns down, which means that we have a lot of fun and there's a decisive action most times these two play against each other, David. Neither of them back down. But also, just one has to really think about the character of the strength of character and the mental fortitude that Arjun's shown in this tournament, right? It's perhaps been one of his absolute worst until yesterday, where he finally got that win in. He comes into the tournament as world number 4 after gaining more than 60 points in 2024 and losing more than 30 until yesterday. And he goes on to win Nordebek again in a fiery, feisty game where anything could have happened. He stays true to his style. He comes on, he's facing the very, very in-form world champion who's undefeated in 2025 so far. Not a single player has been able to win a game against Gukesh right now. And he's going all out with black. He's He's declining the line where you trade and there's a possibility of a repetition. Archer Argasi right now is playing for a win and he's putting the pressure onto Gukesh. To me, it feels like 2024 was Arjun version 1.0. Then we saw him coming to this tournament in January was Arjun version 2.0. And starting February with the win against Norbeg and pushing for a win against Gukesh, it's a brand new Arjun in Feb as well.
Exactly. He was reborn in the month of February, Arjun Erigaisi. And yeah, I mean, the biggest surprise to me, Tanya, he played the Petrov defense, and he's got like the most beautiful attacking position ever as black. I think if you can guarantee this position, then everyone's going to be playing the Petrov defense. Just to mention one chess thing as well, you kind of sparked my kind of curiosity here about exchanging queens. Maybe white can try with one line, but just to show trying to bail out even there. Gukesh isn't safe. You mentioned queen g2 not possible because queen exchange, white would then lose the knight on d5. So the only way is to get rid of that knight on d5 first to get it out of the firing line, and that would be to trade knights. I don't think black has time to take on g3, just to point out, because white has this sneaky move, queen g4 check, getting the queens off the board. The knight recaptures extra piece. So after knight takes knight, now you can play queen to g2. This is what I would do. Chicken chess club stuff here. But even a queen exchange, I'm not sure whether black takes on g3 or takes on g2, but even something like this, white is never ever going to be better. And it's the same problems. It's kind of weaknesses all over the queen side. I think this might be what Gukesh should try just to bail out, but okay, he's actually taken that knight, Tanya. Okay, queen g2. Maybe this is his escape route here. Blue arrow appears. Only way to stem the tide. Only way to survive, maybe.
David, you're playing like the world champion. Gukesh is following your advice. It looks like he sat down, calculated the dangers of bringing that bishop out, and decided it's just too much activity against the white king. Queen g2 must be found because you give black one move. Anything else, you develop your bishop. Pawn takes pawn, rook takes pawn coming in, and Arjun's all over the board as well. It looks extremely scary. To your point, Queen G2, yes, the blue arrow says best move, great spot there, David, but also Arjun isn't forced to just go into that endgame that you're pointing out, where you get the queens off and grab that d4 pawn. We've been talking about that f5 square for the queen. After Queen G2, it might still be game on, with queen going on to f5, and perhaps then we're going to see Queen e4, just insisting on the queen trade. You're dreaming of getting the queens off the board, and maybe you still keep the balance like this. I was hoping to avoid the trade somehow.
Yeah, stop tempting fate, Tanya. Stop it, because now queen h3, queen g2, we could see a dance between the queens. But I don't think Arjun wants the draw either. So even now, to be honest, like you could still take and take, and I don't know if white can grab the pawn on f6. The knight might get trapped there, like this variation. But yeah, I mean this starts to get a bit complicated even with the queens off the board. But I mean, first of all, step one, Gukesh has to play queen g2. You don't survive an attack like this with queens still on the board. So yeah, you mentioned
Yes.
that I'm playing like a world champion. The sad part for Gukesh is he's playing like me, and that's never a good sign. Playing like a grumpy old man. Queen exchange, please. That's not his style. That's definitely not what he wanted when he went for that b4, b5 attack that we were talking about earlier. To find himself in a position, he needs to exchange queens. That's definitely not gone according to plan for the world champion.
It might be the best option right now because David, really, even though the bar might say that that position after the lines that we saw, bringing the bishop out, not going for the queen trade, somehow white is holding or fighting for survival there. But from a human perspective, how precise you need to be move after move is very difficult to do. One inaccuracy could lead to checkmate on the white king in those positions. So completely understandable here, trying to get the queens off the black pieces. So yes, the endgame will be pleasant, but I have a feeling that Gukesh will find a way, perhaps come back with the queen all the way to d7, will find a way to keep them on the board, regardless where you place it. That's just his style of chess.
Exactly. Both of them love a fight, and this game definitely promises that ahead. Yeah, pawn down for Arjun Erigaisi, but he is the one having all the fun right now. Maybe we zoom out of this one for now, Tanya. It is, yeah, maybe again the calm before the storm if the queens remain on the board.
Absolutely. Well, we will check in with this. Let's bring up our beautiful multi board view right in front of us. Very colorful. Which color catches your attention here, David? Prague versus Vincent. Still, it looks like Prague's made some inroads right here, with uh, tension on the center, knight jumping to e5. There's a face off on the left side of the board. I see the bar seems to imply that Prague's doing well. Should that be the game that we jump into next? Because that is the big one for our championship.
Yeah, I trust you. I trust your judgment, Tanya. And it's very important, of course, for the standings. And the game between Abdusattorov and Harikrishna as well, I'd like to jump to at some point. But let's start with Prague. We see him just a couple of moves down the line from where we last left it, but we see him maybe putting some pressure on, maybe gaining the advantage. And that's essential. Essential knowledge for Gukesh as well. If he knows that Prague is better suddenly, then he might be wanting to take more risks and keep the queens on the board himself. Gukesh. So, okay, this is where we find ourselves. Let's just backtrack 2 moves to where we were last at. We last joined it with Vincent playing the very logical pawn to a4, stopping anything happening on the b5 square. b5 would be ideal for Prague to kick this knight away. He played a6. We mentioned this was a possibility. Normally in these structures, Tanya, you would love to play the move a5, right, to lock down, clamp down on any pawn advances en passant would occur, but a5 is covered 3 times by the black pieces and only protected twice by white, so that is impossible. White is just too slow. If the bishop were on d2, white would play a5 and have the advantage, but that's the thing in chess. You can't have everything. g3 instead played. At least the white queen has an escape square, because after b5, knight to a3, we were talking about the knight coming to e5, targeting that queen. I don't think that's the plan anymore. But Tanya, he's at least made one of Vincent's pieces very, very bad here on the side of the board.
Not only the piece, it's also a free pawn right now on a4 that I see. Everyone's sacrificing pawns in this championship round. What happened to a cautious, cagey approach with so much on the line and high stakes matches? We're just seeing fire and action everywhere. Now, David, really interesting play by Black so far, getting that idea in, and Prague is calculating. He's trying to think about whether he can actually capture that a4 pawn. One thing's clear: if you go for it immediately, the white knight perhaps just jumps back to where it came from, giving white all the activity. Look at Prague. He's got his eyes closed. Lot of leg movement there, shaking a lot, calculating the line. I think he's thinking about bringing his own knight to the center of the board, hitting that white queen, and perhaps lines that follow with that. To me, it's not so easy how white is actually fighting for compensation in that position. I think Prague's got his opportunity here. If Prague manages to win this game or create a position where Gukesh feels he's playing for the win, for Gukesh, a draw is as good as a loss then. So he's going to try to really squeeze something out of it, because in both scenarios, if Prague wins, Gukesh has to win. And that puts extra pressure on him to find something in a position where there's nothing. So not only will this game determine what happens here, but perhaps the approach that Gukesh will have on his board.
Yeah, fully agree. I think the first 2 hours of play here, the happier of the 2 leaders is Pragnananda. He's got a position that's rich, full of opportunity, full of possibility. Anything could happen here. But for Gukesh, he's going down some force lines, fighting for survival, fighting for his life. And yeah, not only are the players fighting their opponents today, they're fighting each other, of course. So all these kind of storylines building towards what is going to be an exciting climax of the day for Prague. So many moves possible. I love your knight to e5, Tanya. I love the idea of that you mentioned earlier, bringing the other knight back potentially over towards the queen side. And yeah, Prague crunching those numbers, trying to calculate a path forward. And yeah, it's just so tense. And I've played these positions a lot. Normally, I'm the side kind of cramped. So in this case, I would be on the side of Vincent Keimer with white. And I really hate it when the queen side starts to open up. The queen side is where Prague, black's pieces tend to be finding the activity, finding nice outposts, nice squares, b4 a nice square as well for the black knights. and it just feels like he's in full control. The Karukan defense for the win, it looks like, for Pragnananda right now.
A big moment on our championship Sunday on Gukesh's board as well as Prag's board, and it feels like out of the two players, perhaps it's Prag who should be happier out of the opening, even though he is playing with the black pieces. And our feature chat saying, "Come on, Prague." A lot of rooting going on for the players. David, we've got both our boards in front of us. And is it fair to say that despite Gukesh being white, Prague is the happier one with black right now?
Oh, yes, Tanya. And especially after that last move, we see Gukesh actually move his rook to the side, so not exchanging queens. But the bar does not like Gukesh's choice. Erigaisi now with a big advantage, apparently. It's definitely Prag, the happier of the two. Pragnananda started with black, but he kept the tension. He's been outplaying Vincent Keimer, it looks like, over the last few moves. Gukesh started with white, but has been outplayed by Arjun Erigaisi. Of course, later in the middle game is the critical moment, and Gukesh is known for his ability to lock things down, to find the best moves when things get really clutch. But yeah, early days, Pragnananda, the happier of the leading pair.
Well, it's been a day of great chats, and I've got more good news coming in. A lot of our chat has been asking, where is Peter Lecco? Why is he not in commentary? And that's because, chat, he is at Waikanze. And I've just heard that we have got an interview with him coming up where he talks about all the stories. And there are so many of them that we had to make it in 2 parts, and we'll be playing those for our subscribers during break. And that's something that you definitely don't want to miss. So do consider subscribing. Not only will you hear Peter, but you'll also be ad-free. And you'll be ad-free when you're playing on chess.com and exploring all the very cool features there. But for now, we will get back to the games. Use this time to subscribe, to hear Peter later in the break, and all the subscription perks. Right now, David, chess is the biggest perk because of the action that we're getting in front of us. 9a3 on the board, and I think it's time to head over to that board. We've done so much deep diving on all the attacking possibilities that Arjun has. We'll see the approach he has. Will we see a queen trade? But big news, rook d1 instead. I just noticed that Gukesh didn't find the only move.
Yeah, Gukesh taking a massive risk. He's so keen to keep the queens on, so keen to keep his winning chances alive that he's pushing the boundaries of what is possible, what is objectively correct, Gukesh. And yeah, I mean, we saw it during the World Championship. It seemed to pay off more often than not. I think he's just playing the numbers. He's such a practical player, Gukesh. I think he doesn't get enough credit for it. We talk about calculation, how it's really scientific, but he does play the psychology. He's like, okay, I think this is fine. I know my own boundaries. I know what I can get away with or what you're comfortable with. And I don't know, Tanya. We'll either praise this as genius, playing Rook D1, and it's going to pay off and he's going to win, or we might come back and pinpoint this move as the start of a downward spiral. But okay, he defends his pawn, so he's just saying, I'm going to suffer, but I'm going to suffer for something at least. And okay, Arjun needs to now find some concrete compensation before White's able to play moves like Bishop F4, but maybe before able to improve this knight, bring it over to the defense. Maybe we can try and work out why this is a mistake.
Yeah, and that question, what you just said about Rook D1 and Gukesh's practical approach of keeping the game going, we'll only know the answer to that, whether this was an accurate decision or not in hindsight, right? Once we have the knowledge of how this game plays out, life makes sense backwards, chess decisions make sense backwards as well. You're either lauded as a hero or perhaps, hey, did you take too much risk? But David, we're going to deep dive. I just want to follow up on that psychological point that you make because that's been such a pattern with Gukesh we've been seeing. And it kind of reminds me of Magnus in some ways back in 2010 when we had just broken into the world as a world number one. And the first few years of his domination that we saw, right, it was such a game changer in which he would just continue to play, continue to fight out these dry positions, squeeze water out of stone. He would go on to win those positions, what we would later on call a vintage Magnus victory. And by the way, we do have a move on the board. Pawn takes pawn play. So Gukesh will have to take a decision. And I don't believe he has too many options here, right? You have to. You do you have options? Yes, he has to take with the pawn because queen takes pawn would have perhaps been disaster after the queen moving back.
And Tanya, look at the camera. Prag is watching this game. Prag is just standing there. He's actually on the side where Gukesh can see him as well. He's not standing behind Gukesh's shoulder. He's standing behind Arjun's shoulder because he wants Arjun to do him a favor. And this pretty much sums up exactly how it feels to be at the top of a tournament. In any tournament where you're one of the leaders, okay, there we go. He walks away. He's made his conclusions, but yeah, they're keeping an eye on each other's games. It's undeniable, and that's the practical thing to do. I just had to point it out while Prague was there for that for that brief moment. But as you say, H takes G3. In terms of the chess, I mean, this H file, oh, don't try it at home because this is terrifying. The white queen's on a good defensive square. And just to point out, just to make some moves, queen h2 check. The white king wanders away. I don't think this is a bad move necessarily for black, but another check doesn't really cut the mustard here because the white king can walk towards the center. And yes, he might regain the d4 pawn after an exchange, but now this endgame is yeah, just totally level and up for grabs. So I don't know if you should rush queen h2 check. What other moves come to mind, Tanya? Any other candidate moves here?
Well, it's not very easy to spot one very quickly, but I also want to just show, because it might have appeared that queen takes pawn does offer the queen trade. And the point I wanted to make earlier was, David, that of course black doesn't exchange queens. After queen takes pawn, you simply fall back. To me, f5 looked like a very attractive square. Queen h5 or queen f5 are the two moves that I would consider in this position. And the point is that now the g file is opened up as well, with bishop d6 and rook g8 landing next. You know, it's you're just walking into fire by queen takes pawn. It's a move that gives you temporary relief for one move, denied, and then it's eternal suffering here. This would be absolute disaster for the white king. So Gukesh was indeed forced to allow that queen h2 check, but the endgame that would ensue by regaining material as black, the one you were talking about, now that black's pawns are doubled up on f5, I think any endgame would be fine for white, despite having, well, the sad pawn formation on the left side of the board. So for Arjun, it's all about getting the attack in. Now to the more tough question. In this position, what are the candidate moves? Again, I'm always attracted to getting the bishop out. Finish your development. The two worst placed pieces for black in this position, the knight on a5, the bishop on f8. So it's got to be around that. You're pointing out two squares, bishop d6, bishop b4. I've been harping about the d6 square, also eyeing the g3 pawn. To me, that just feels like it assists the attack a little bit more. Bishop b4, on the other hand, David, comes with a direct threat. You want to grab the knight, and then the checks on the h file will be a lot more powerful.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very attracted to bishop b6 as well. I think that would be my first instinct. Just it looks like you might have some sacrifices, especially teaming up with that rook that you mentioned that could land on g8. Two open files better than one. But yeah, I was always taught look for threats first, and the immediate threat of bishop takes knight does guarantee you gaining at least a tempo, a bit of time. So I think those would be my two main candidate moves. Knight c4, the other one you mentioned. When in doubt, invite another piece to the party, improve the worst placed piece. That also makes some sense, but a bit more vague. I don't see the concrete threat behind that one. So I think a bishop move, the most likely, Tanya. And yeah, I don't know where to begin with calculation, to be honest. White has to move the knight. I think the knight is going to come via e4 or maybe e2 and f4 to try and ride to the rescue.
Yeah, the one drawback of placing the bishop on d6 could be that you're disconnecting the black rook from that d4 pawn. So all those lines where we have to eventually give a check on h2 and perhaps trade on h1 don't work in black's favor once the bishop lands to d6. So the resource you mentioned, right, bishop d6, now you're hitting the bishop and the pawn. Arjun does make a choice. He does improve one of the two pieces, and it's the option that we briefly mentioned, knight c4 on the board.
Wow. I didn't expect that, I've got to say. I was expecting the bishop to come out. I was like, oh, it's going to be a bishop move. It's one of the two, 50-50. But of course, that's, again, I noticed something about the younger generation. They always play the moves, or they always look for the move that the opponent doesn't expect. So I find it very difficult to predict the moves of, like, Alireza Firouzja, for example. Arjun is one of them. And, I mean, Gukesh may be easier, I would say, to predict because he's always looking for the more direct calculation-based move. But yeah, Arjun, knight c4, great move. The bar really kind of endorses that one, Tanya. +1 advantage for black. That's very significant. I don't know what the threat is. Maybe he's just trying to immobilize the white pieces, because I do notice some tricks. You mentioned it, actually, like knight to e4, which is a desirable kind of defensive move, or so it seems. Maybe could be met now with the move knight to e5. I think this is his kind of concept. And now that the white knight has moved away, attacking the queen, of course, if you ever take this knight, then whoops, rook takes rook. The white queen gets lured away, and this is checkmate in the corner. And after knight to e5, queen swap doesn't help either, because queen to h5, or maybe there's something even stronger there. But now you hit the rook, you land a knight and f3 next move, and this just looks like game over. So he's got sneaky plans. He's got some traps up his sleeve, Arjun Aragaisi.
Very big practical problems, and Gukesh puts on his lucky hoodie. He might be needing it over the next few moves, because, David, it's the kind of position where one mistake and you're completely lost with an attack against the king. And the knight, we often talk about it. Well, it's a great defender, but also a fantastic attacker, right? The closer it gets to the white king, it could find itself rerouting itself even via the d6 square at some point. d6, knight f5, and you're targeting the g3 pawn and the d4 pawn. I want to say the fact that Arjun has taken this pause and has just simply improved the knight which was at the edge of the board, placed it on the square c4. It just goes on to show how comfortable he is about his compensation here. It goes on to show that how much of a powerful position he feels he has, that he doesn't need to rush through with the attack. He doesn't need to come in with a move like bishop b4 that immediately has a threat, or a move like trying to place the rook on g8 that immediately threatens the g3 pawn or sacrifices along that direction. So knight c4, a very classy approach. I also noticed how the bar approves perhaps the best move in the position. For intense initiative and peace activity against the king.
Yeah, and this is the dream attacking position. You kind of hinted at it there, Tanya, but he's not even risking too much. Of course, we all want to go down in the history books with sacrifices, attack, and always have the option to kind of bail out just in case it goes wrong. Then it's kind of just a big bonus. And it feels like at some point, even if things go wrong for Arjun, he can play like queen h2, as we saw, queen h1 check, force the queens off, get the rook off, and regain the pawn. So he won't even be material down. He can bail out to a drawish endgame where there's still some life left. So for Arjun, there's minimal risk here, but for Gukesh, I mean, the risk is you just get mated and you just get knocked out in the next few moves. I barely even see an idea here for white. I mean, maybe bishop f4. I mean, it's hard to know where to start. And Tanya, you mentioned something yesterday in our broadcast. You mentioned it was a lucky hoodie from Gukesh. Is that based on something he said? I noticed the hoodie is on. He's trying to change things up.
It is on. We saw this at the World Championship match. He always had the hoodie with him in the lounge. And he mentioned, well, he hasn't confirmed or denied whether he's superstitious about it, but we've seen it with him at many tournaments for Gukesh. And the results seem to be working out for him. In this tournament as well, a few times he's got it on at the right moment and managed to win. Well, I don't think we've had a confirmation from him, but only speculation, anecdotal evidence on this one. But in any case, he decides it's time to bring it on. Perhaps needs all the luck that he can right now, David, as well, given the position that we're in. And as Gukesh, in this very treacherous moment, thinks and tries to navigate all the complications, it's time for us to go into a short break. But you don't want to miss any of the action coming up. And also, we do leave our subscribers with an interview with Fiona talking to the legendary Peter Lecco. Take a look.
I'm joined now by Grandmaster Peter Lecco. Peter, first of all, thank you so much for making the time. Welcome.
Thanks a lot.
You have been here in Weichensee in so many capacities. We'll talk more about that a bit later, but this year you're here as a second of Vincent Keimer. The tournament is drawing to a close. How do you reflect on it?
Well, the tournament wasn't really going as hoped or expected. One thing was clear, Vincent is fighting like always, but he wasn't really getting the reward for it. The whole tournament was like a struggle because there was no logic behind the result of his games. For example, if you take the start of the tournament, he had some very shaky games at the beginning, but he won and he scored the victory. Then there was this golden opportunity in the third round against Veil. When in the preparation, you remember, yeah, he was 1 hour on the clock and he was unable to use that moment. It could have meant so much. Yeah, it's a completely different tournament. Then +2 after 3 rounds, all the positive emotions. You enjoy that. Wow, I for the first time switched to A5 systems in the Italian. I get the reward and fantastic. Yeah, Miss it's gonna be a very long event, and yeah, he's fighting. I think his average is like 6 hours play, more or less, from all the
He
games.
spent a lot of time in the playground.
Exactly, yeah. Now he has a very big game playing against Prague in the